Stuck inside my mind in this quarantine house. The light at the end of the tunnel isn't in sight. Where do I go to find someone to talk to about all of my wants? You can never be holiday. Tell me the lies. I searched until nothing found us there and missed online. Said I'm anxious and depressed and my coping skills are not fine. We weren't a fit and it felt like a waste of time. I heard an interview and I felt an instant connection. I learned CAT, DVD, and my book skills and each and every session. I'm pulling through, ready to ask the next question. The next question. The next question. The next question. The next question.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider making a donation to the podcast via Venmo to the username @NQCATX. Hello, and welcome to NextQuest podcast, where I ask your potential therapist questions so you don't have to. I am your host, Noah S. Garcia, licensed professional counselor supervisor. Today, I welcome to the show Samantha Meyer, licensed professional counselor associate, supervised by Natasha Justo, licensed professional counselor supervisor, who will be discussing her practice in an area of specialty, mental health accessibility, and mutual aid. Welcome to the show, Samantha.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So tell us about your credentials and experience.
Sure. So I am a licensed professional counselor associate, and my experience is in several different settings. I started out my career working for Integral Care, which is the county mental health authority, doing community-based counseling and case management. And I've also worked in a residential setting, a residential treatment center for teens. So working with adolescents is another area of focus for me. And now I'm in private practice at Moving Parts Psychotherapy.
Okay, cool. Now, I know LPC Associates generally don't accept insurance. I think there's maybe one or two insurance plans that have started allowing associates to bill under their supervisor's NPI. I think it's the primary one is Cigna. So I'm assuming you probably don't accept insurance.
I don't. No, unfortunately not.
Do you have a sliding scale or reduced fee?
I do. So I have a couple different avenues for sliding scale referrals. One of them is a website called OpenPath. So I accept clients through OpenPath. They have sliding scale. It's like a membership that clients can access, and then they have access to providers at a sliding scale. And then also just to the referrals I get through Moving Parts, I also offer a sliding scale to those clients as well.
Cool. Do you have weekend or evening appointments?
I do evenings 2 days a week. I don't do weekends. That's my work-life balance. Weekends are family and friend time. But I do, right now it's Tuesdays and Wednesdays are my evenings.
Okay, cool. Is being a therapist your first career? If not, what was?
It is my first career. I am 27. So I haven't had much time for a second career, but yeah, it's kind of what I always knew I wanted to do.
Yeah, I figured as much, but I didn't want to judge. Yeah. You never know.
You never know, I guess.
What drew you to being a therapist?
It was a lot of things. I've always been a very nosy person who wanted to know everyone's business. A
la chisme.
Yeah.
It's Spanish for gossip.
Yeah. I was really lucky to have parents that were always very open about their mental health and allowed me to be open about my mental health. And were open about their experiences in therapy. So I knew from a really young age, like that's a job that someone can have. And it is a way of helping people. And I think initially, I was just like, that'd be a really cool job. Just get to talk to people all day and help them out and know their secrets. And I think for a nosy kid that was that really liked other people and was interested in other people, it just seemed like a cool career to have. And my dad, he went back to school to study psychology when I was probably like 10-ish. And he would come home and talk about what he was learning. I'm a twin. I have a twin sister. So he would tell us about the twin studies. And it just piqued my interest. I was just like, this is a really cool thing to study. And, it was one of those things that just stuck as I went through college and grad school. The interest stayed there.
So you enjoy, as the kids say these days, sipping the tea.
Yes, I do.
See,
spilling the tea, cool. Sipping the tea.
And, I would, though, like to reframe being nosy as curiosity.
Yeah, it was very much so. I was a very curious kid. And I think the nosiness came in when I had a tendency to eavesdrop. I do think that came from curiosity. But also, sometimes I just look back and I'm just like, man, I just wanted to know everything.
Well, I mean, I think curiosity is a really important, what would that be? Quality, I suppose, for a therapist to have.
Sure. Yeah. I think I rely on it a lot in my clinical work, just being able to follow my own curiosity as a way of understanding my clients and as a way of opening up new avenues of discussion. I think it's really helpful. And I'm glad I found a career where that quality is seen as a positive thing.
Okay. So what modalities do you use with folks?
I'm pretty eclectic. So I'm very trauma focused. So the main trauma processing modality I will use is EMDR.
Okay.
And I love that modality. Originally my first modality I was trained in, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, it was motivational interviewing.
Cool. Yeah.
I actually think that harm reduction approach, it was actually before that in grad school, I worked for UT's alcohol harm reduction program.
Cool. Yeah.
So that's where I picked up the MI stuff. But I do think that harm reduction approach still informs a lot of my work. And then after that, I learned CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which was it was the first modality where I was like, oh my God, this is how my brain works, And it's really helpful, I think, in a lot of the work that I do with teens. Actually, I think just teaching those fundamental skills of, recognizing your emotions, being able to name them, and being able to challenge negative thought patterns is I love being able to teach that and learn alongside my clients, both the kids and adults, in doing that. And then recently I've been learning internal family systems therapy, and I am loving it.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's also something that I've been incorporating into my practice. And I found just enormously helpful with my clients. And I suppose that's probably a good overview, but I'm always kind of looking for that opportunity to learn that next thing. And I'm a total theory nerd. So any chance I have for trainings and specific, especially the different trauma processing modalities, I feel like I could be learning forever. All the different modalities. Yeah. And I'm excited to do that, honestly.
That's awesome. Let's tell us a little bit about yourself. What are your hobbies, interests, TV shows you're watching, music, pets, etc.?
Yeah. So let's see. I've been in Austin for I guess about 8 years now. It's since undergrad, really. So it's been a minute. But I love the live music scene here when it is happening. It's just now starting to come back a little bit. Yeah. But live music is a big hobby of mine. especially seeing local acts. I just love being in a place where I can do that. And I'm also a writer. Writing is another hobby I have on the side. I like to write fiction. Right now, I'm working on a sci-fi novel, which is a lot of fun.
Cool.
And I do have a pet. I have a cat named Teddy. He's named after Theodore Lawrence from Little Women. I got him right before the pandemic. So, of course, now we both have separation anxiety. But he is the cutest cat in the world, in my unbiased opinion.
Totally unbiased.
Totally unbiased. Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, let's talk a little bit about mental health accessibility and mutual aid. So, what are your thoughts about accessibility of mental health services in Texas and more specifically in Austin?
I guess generally I would say it's not good. It's not good. No. I think there are a lot of barriers to accessibility, cost being the main one. I think mental health care is prohibitively expensive for a lot of people, really the majority of people. And insurance, even when people have insurance, it can be very difficult to access mental health care because it's not guaranteed that you're going to have coverage for mental health benefits specifically, or even if you do, that coverage is going to be sufficient.
Right.
And then without insurance, I do think that that Austin really tries to innovate and find ways to help people access affordable mental health care. I think there are a lot of really amazing practices here, group practices that are specifically focused on affordable care and accessibility. I did my one of my practicums in grad school at Capital Area Counseling, which is a really amazing place for that. And I think it's an example of just the ways that people in the city have tried to innovate to increase accessibility. But even somewhere like Capital Area, wait lists are really long.
Right.
There's just such a need for it. And I think the experience of people trying to access care and experience as a provider is just this overwhelming feeling of there's just not enough to meet the need for affordable care.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'd imagine that there are significant disparities in mental health accessibility based on a variety of factors, including race, gender, etc. Do you happen to have any stats on this?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess the best metric we have, even though this is not a perfect metric, but it is the one we have the most data on, is rates of people who are uninsured. So if we look at Texas as a whole, before COVID, 1 in 5 Texans were uninsured. And now that number after COVID is 1 in 3 Texans is uninsured. Yeah. Yeah. And that rate of lack of insurance is higher for Black Texans than it is for white Texans. And it's actually double for Latinx Texans than it is for white Texans.
Interesting. Do we know what factors are contributing to that, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot of those compounding disparities in employment. I think we can look at labor trends a lot to understand this, because in the U.S., insurance is tied to employment, and I think there are certain jobs where health insurance comes with that job, and there are certain jobs where it doesn't. And I think that because Texas has so few worker protections, there are becoming more and more jobs that do not come with health insurance, a lot more contracting, a lot more, gig jobs. And I think people that have less social capital in general and are oppressed in, multiple ways are more likely to only have access to jobs that come without those benefits,
For sure.
So I think it's a lot of compounding trends there that create those disparities.
One program I definitely want to mention on the show is MAP, or Medical Access Program, run through Central Health. That's a really great program for people, and really helps with medical care, especially for folks who have chronic conditions. Can you think of any other resources?
Yeah, so I think just one resource that I do want to shout out that is another local group that I believe they're new and unhelped up during COVID is I think it's called the Austin Wellness Network. I'll double check that, but it's a website that they've compiled a list of affordable mental health care services in the Austin area. It's a really comprehensive directory, and they are just really trying hard to connect people that need affordable care with providers that provide that. So I do want to shout them out because I really love the work that they're doing.
Awesome. Austin Wellness Network. I'll have to look that up.
Yeah.
So, we talked briefly about this just now, but it's often the case that even though somebody has health insurance, they may still be unable to access mental health services. And one of the reasons for this is, that particular insurance policy may have a mental health exclusion, for example, similar to how a lot of insurance companies will also have a transgender exclusionary policy in which they won't cover any transgender related care. But there are other reasons for that as well. What more can you tell us?
Sure. So another reason that a lot of people cite is even if they do have mental health benefits, sometimes that copay is still not affordable. It can be a really high copay, and they might technically, quote unquote, have benefits, but it's not enough to really make care accessible. Another thing to keep in mind is that there might not be enough providers in network that accept their insurance. I hear a lot of the time that people fill up, and insurance companies don't always maintain a large enough network of providers to serve their customers, and that's a huge issue. I think another thing that comes to mind is, mental health care also looks like medication sometimes, and medication costs can be prohibitively high, especially for folks that need that brand medication, and there might not be a generic available that can run up the cost very quickly.
Absolutely.
Another thing also is that people change jobs. They get different insurance and they can't keep their providers that they've built that connection with. And that is really difficult for people. I think makes accessing care difficult because so much of the success of the work that we do as counselors, depends on that relationship. So
Absolutely.
to have, outside forces come between that relationship can really disrupt care for a lot of folks.
Yeah, and another thing I want to mention too is some insurance plans have a really high deductible, and they won't cover any service until that deductible is met, which leaves the client paying the provider's contracted rate until they've met their deductible, which can be, depending on the insurance, it can be reasonable or it can be pretty high.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, that's a really good point.
So I would call that underinsured.
Yeah, I think that's what we see a lot is we see, in Texas, a lot of people are uninsured and a lot more people are underinsured, especially when it comes to mental health care.
Right. So in thinking about mutual aid, what are the principles of mutual aid? Sure.
So I want to speak on this, and I can really, speak on this from the perspective of ATX Mental Health Fund, which is the mutual aid fund that I founded. But when I was founding the fund, I tried to do my research about the values of mutual aid that we would use as our guiding post for creating this organization. So the first one that comes to mind is this idea of solidarity and not charity. And I define that as, understanding that it's not like there's one group of people that needs help and one group of people that provides help. We all shift between roles at different points in our lives, even throughout the same day. And I think that's really important to me as a value, as a mental health care provider who is also a consumer of mental health services. And, that's something I try to impart to my clients as well. And I think that is also a big principle of mutual aid is this idea of inhabiting multiple roles, and both giving and receiving help. And also, within this concept of solidarity and not charity, is an intentional move away from traditional ideas and avenues of philanthropy rooted in capitalism, where you have wealthy benefactors bestowing aid on specific people or groups of people who are deemed deserving. And solidarity is inherently different in that concept because it is standing with someone and not above someone. It's removing that hierarchy and that power structure as much as possible, and trusting people to define the needs that they have, and to use the resources that we have to respond to those needs.
Mm-hmm. So, as I understand it rather than it being a like top down type of structure, it's more like bottom up, but also horizontal.
Yes. Mm-hmm. That is really what we aim for, is that horizontal approach, reaching out and building relationships within the community, and using those relationships to distribute resources equitably.
Mm-hmm. In what ways is mutual aid a response in some ways to capitalism? And in what ways is mutual aid rooted in anarchist thought?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there.
I know. I'm excited.
So for some background, I was introduced to the concept of mutual aid actually by way of the prison abolition movement, which I came to read a lot about that movement through my work at Integral Care. You talked, and you've also worked for Integral Care too, so I think you can understand a lot of this. But my job at Integral Care was working primarily with folks that were either uninsured or were on Medicare and Medicaid. A lot of the folks that I worked with had multiple disabilities, and most of them were living in extreme poverty, and seeing what because of my privilege, that was something that I really hadn't seen before that job, and seeing how the poorest people in this country live on a day-to-day basis, seeing how people with severe mental illness live on a day-to-day basis, was, in a word, radicalizing for me. And it made me extremely angry and kind of despairing. And it made me search for answers and frameworks to help explain what I was seeing, but also give me a way to not feel hopeless about it. And that was where I got really into prison abolition, as like, into like the answer that I found in that. So abolition, is, about tearing down that carceral system, imagining a world without police and prisons, but it's also a positive project about building the systems that we want to see to create that world without prisons and police, trying to prefigure that world now as much as we can. And I think that's where mutual aid comes in as a concept. And I think it is rooted in anarchist thought in some ways, because it asks that question, of what can people do for each other without state support? And there are a lot of oppressed communities that have had to figure out how to live without state support, who the state has abandoned, or is actively trying to destroy. And I think mutual aid is really just learning from those communities and the way that they have innovated in order to survive, and trying to apply those solutions to create a safety net within communities when the state has neglected to do so.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like, in some ways, similar to like ontological anarchy. I don't know if you're familiar with any of the writings of Hakeem Bey, but I love his stuff. And ontological anarchy basically says that there's no way we can really know, like, quote, the true nature of things. And therefore, anything can only be founded on nothing. And then out of nothing, we can make something.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is part of what was helpful for me to find through these theories, and also the practice of abolition and the practice of mutual aid was just, what do you do when you feel that sinking feeling of free fall of God, there's nothing for that, there's nothing that these people need, what resources are there? And I think that was maybe a feeling you remember from working at Integral Care, but
Yes.
I felt that way a lot with my clients. It was, terrifying, and I think that came a lot from empathizing with their situation, even for a second. And it just, really put me in a place of despair. And I think that building up from nothing and how to do that is something that was really, really necessary for me at that point in my career and in my understanding of the way the world works. When someone that I've read a lot that has been really helpful is Mariame Kaba, who's a prison abolitionist and organizer. She founded an organization called Survived and Punished that works with survivors of domestic violence that have been incarcerated for defending themselves against an abuser. And she often says that hope is a discipline. And that's something that really resonated with me as thinking about mutual aid as that discipline of practicing hope and trying to build something better.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean by that feeling. It's just this overwhelming helplessness. You can't do anything about this person's struggling. I mean, it's very frustrating, and I can see where that would have impacted and maybe shifted a worldview in some ways.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like I didn't know that we had an issue with the lack of a social safety net in this country before then, but seeing the reality of it, it hits different. I'll say that. Absolutely.
So we live in an individualistic and capitalistic society in which the idea of, survival of the fittest is rampant and is often used as a means of justifying marginalization in a variety of ways, including poverty, gender inequality, racism, and even war. However, natural law lends more to the cooperation and connection of communities, with the formation of horizontal networks of solidarity versus top-down power structures. We can see these sorts of cooperatives in all of nature. I was watching silly videos the other day, and it reminds me of this video I saw in which a lion was being surrounded by a clan of hyenas, which I learned something too. I learned that a group of hyenas is called a clan. And doing this. And anyway, this lion was dangerously outnumbered and facing certain death. At the last second, the lion's pride ran up on the hyenas and chased the clan of hyenas off, saving the lion that was in distress. What are your thoughts in general about topics of individualism, capitalism, and social solidarity? And more specifically, what are your thoughts about these topics as it applies to mental health accessibility and mutual aid?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I love that question. And I have a lot of thoughts. But, I think really my experiences at Integral Care instilled this belief that, we can judge a society's morality based on how that society cares for people that can't care for themselves. And also really taught me this idea that sanity in a lot of ways is a total lottery, it's really something, and I think facing that can be really destabilizing and scary for people, but it's true, there's a lot we don't know about mental illness and a lot that is out of someone's control when it comes to maintaining their mental health. I guess in short, I could kind of give a shit if it goes against the natural order. I'm not really very interested in what is the natural order of things, and left to our base instincts, are humans competitive or cooperative? I could kind of give a shit. But
I mean, it really ultimately doesn't matter.
Ultimately, it doesn't matter to me because we are intelligent creatures, and we the collective project of humanity is deciding what kind of world we want to build, and our intelligence allows us to do that. And we're not, in some ways we are dependent on our base instincts, but in a lot of ways we're not, especially collectively, and especially thinking long term. The long-term project of society building. We are a lot more than our base instincts. Also, low-key, I'm Jewish, so that social Darwinism stuff never really passed the smell test for me. So that's Nazi stuff. So from early on, I was just like, ooh, yeah, that's that hasn't played out well. For my people. So I think that, and then in addition to that, capitalism ties your worth to economic productivity. And there are groups of people that are just always going to lose in that system. And I think, I worked with a lot of folks that are disabled, and through that, became interested in the disability rights movement. And I think there's a lot that movement articulates about, why that concept of tying human worth to economic productivity is inhumane, and it's also just kind of bullshit. It's kind of the least effective way to understand human worth. And I think that I believe that people have value regardless of their economic productivity, and that they deserve a dignified life regardless of that, which is an inherently anti-capitalist belief, I think, in some ways. And, that being said, I do think that humans are fundamentally social and interdependent creatures. I think that we, more so than a lot of other species, are profoundly dependent on caretakers for a good portion of our lives, both at the beginning of our lives and at the end of our lives, and frequently in the middle of our lives too. We literally cannot survive without other people. And I think social solidarity and mutual aid just kind of acknowledges that as a fact. Another person's writing that I have found really helpful is Eve Ewing, who's a professor at the University of Chicago, and does a lot of research around school closures in Chicago and that impact on Black children in that region. And she's a sociologist and a really phenomenal poet and writer as well. And she did an interview with Miriam Kaba, who I mentioned before. And in that interview, Eve Ewing says something, I'm paraphrasing, it was just something to the effect of like, everything worth doing is done with other people. And I think that's something that really I thought about a lot when I was trying to figure out how to make a Tech's mental health fund work. And I think something that I realized early on was that the organization couldn't really become real for me until I involved other people in that organizing process. And that mutual aid is about building relationships with your community, and that step one of any mutual aid project, before any money gets involved, or really even before an organization gets off the ground, is just going to be thinking about the relationships that you have and how to build those relationships, and how to and thinking about who you are accountable to. And that's where other people are necessary, is because, you have to be accountable to someone and you have to be accountable to your community to work effectively.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was a long answer.
No, that was a good answer. Thank you for entertaining that question.
Yeah, of course. I love talking about this stuff. I love to get into the weeds.
So has COVID impacted the availability of mutual aid?
Yeah, I think what was really cool to see, and really the inspiration for ATAC's Mental Health Fund, was seeing a lot of mutual aid groups crop up in response to COVID. And I think for a lot of people, when I think about radicalizing events, for me, it was working at urban care and seeing what extreme poverty looks like face to face. For a lot of people, I think it was COVID. I think it was it really laid bare the lack of a social safety net that exists in this country. And I think people that may not have had to think about that before had to think about it. And also, I think it revealed in a lot of ways the states, not just the state of Texas, but like the nation state of the United States, you know, the capacity of the state to help. And I think it really sunk in for a lot of people that it's not a matter of the state wants to help but can't, but that they can help and won't. You know, the resources are there. There's when Wall Street needed a bailout, the resources were there. They found that money, you know, and I think even something like increasing unemployment benefits was something that could have always been done and just wasn't. You know, I think it just really laid plain a number of things, you know, the health disparities that exist along racial lines, you know, specifically, and also, I mean, even looking within a single city, you know, depending on what zip code you're in, you know, that could determine mortality, you know, from this pandemic. And I think it was really radicalizing for a lot of people to see all these things clearly and play out in real time. And I think people go looking for answers, and one of the answers they find is mutual aid. And there were a lot of projects that started during COVID that were really inspiring and innovative. I want to shout out ATX Free Fridge Project, which was one of the big inspirations for COVID. I did a bit of volunteering with them last summer, and that I think it's just a really incredible community project. And then even just, you know, I mean, mutual aid can look like a lot of different things, you know, even something like the Buy Nothing Facebook groups that sprung up and during crises like the beginning of the pandemic and the winter storm, where really all you had access to was your immediate neighborhood. Just seeing the way people build those relationships and try to meet each other's needs, you know, that is also mutual aid. And I think that these crises that we are facing together, the pandemic, and then also the climate crisis, which became clear to Texas earlier this year. I think those relationships and those relationships and those organizations that we build are going to become and stay, you know, more important as these crises continue.
Totally. How does mutual aid with the ATX Mental Health Fund work? And it sounds like, from what you've said, that you started and maintained this organization or this mutual aid fund.
Yeah, I don't do it by myself. So I have, I guess you call it like a board of folks. So I founded the organization with another counselor colleague, someone I knew from grad school, my friend Laura, who's great and still works for Integral Care. She's still in the trenches. I have mad respect for her and the work that she does as a clinician and as a case manager. But I also, some folks on the board work for the City Housing Authority, work for the city in general in different capacities. I have some friends who were at LBJ Public Policy School who graduated a year or two after I did. So we're also kind of thinking about these issues with their classmates, and just a lot of, and I think it was also important to me that, the people on the board we're also consumers of mental health care ourselves. And I also want to shout out my sister, who is the social media savvy one of the group. She runs all of our social media accounts, which has been really invaluable in building the community around ATX Mental Health Fund. So she works for GoDaddy and really understands that world of social media that's so far from my area of expertise. And when I told her about the idea and asked her to help out, she was so game and just so ready to jump in and figure this out with me. So I could not do it without the people that I I started this with. But ATX Mental Health Fund. So one part of what we do is direct cash assistance for people to access care. So people apply to the fund. They fill out our request form. They request, however much money they are needing within our parameters based on usually what we're able to give. And then we have folks rate the urgency of their need. And that was really, trying to figure out a way to remove hierarchy as much as possible and give people, give our requesters the agency to determine how urgent their need is, and then prioritizing requests based on that urgency rating. So trying to make that distribution process as collaborative as possible, which is really hard to do, but we are trying. And then, myself and the rest of the team, maintain the fund. We have a fiscal sponsor called the Open Collective Foundation. Open Collective is an open source platform for organizations, and specifically for it's a fundraising platform. So we have our own fundraising page where people donate, and that's where we do all our fundraising through. And our organization is part of the Open Collective Foundation. So through fiscal sponsorship, our donations are tax deductible, and it basically keeps everything above board tax-wise and financially without us having to be tax experts ourselves, because we are not. We're counselors. Although I do have one of the board members is our budget guy, and whenever I have tax questions, I will ask Dashel, who's the budget guy on the board. But Open Collective has been so supportive of us from day one. And and a big part of, I think, when you're doing direct cash assistance, a big question and a big barrier, I think, to this kind of organizing is, what do you do about taxes? What do you do about money? Where do you keep the money? All that complicated stuff, that bureaucracy. And our fiscal sponsor, Open Collective, just really allows us to focus on the organizing work itself, and just have this built-in method of transparency for all of our all of our finances.
Yeah, I'd imagine that's very difficult, and I'm glad you have a guy for that.
Yeah, it's enormously helpful, especially as a new organization. And also it's another method of accountability, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And Open Collective has similar values, I think, in the way that it views transparency and accountability. Every transaction that we have is it's all public. You can see it from donors. People can make their account, and we have our requesters leave out any identifying information to protect their privacy. But you can see the complete record, and that is something that is built into the platform. So it's not something that we have to spend a ton of resources doing, and that allows us to use resources elsewhere, which is great.
Yeah, that's awesome. So how would one go about making a donation to the ATX Mental Health Fund?
Yeah, so you can go to our Open Collective page, which is just, opencollective.com/ATX Mental Health Fund. There's a couple different ways to donate. You can become a sustaining donor, which basically involves a monthly donation to ATX Mental Health Fund. It's so helpful because that allows us to plan and project out how much we're going to be able to distribute every month. Or you can make a one-time donation. We also usually at some point, at one point or another, have some kind of fundraiser going on. So coming up later, I believe next week, we're going to have a raffle on our Instagram. We've gotten a lot of support from local businesses and artists in Austin throughout the time that we've been active. And one of the ways that they support us is by donating art and jewelry and any manner of beautiful things to our raffles and auctions that we do through social media, and that's one of the ways that we fundraise. So if you, it's a jewelry auction coming up. So if you're looking for a nice pair of earrings or a beautiful necklace from a local artist, check out our Instagram page.
Cool. Will you send me the Instagram page
I will, yeah. All our social media, I think it's all the handle, at ATX Mental Health Fund. Except on Twitter, I think it's ATXMH Fund because of character limits. So
Gotcha. Okay. And so that's in making a donation. Now you had mentioned to request assistance, there's a form that somebody would need to fill out. Where is that located? On your website?
Yeah, so it's on our website. It's on our link tree, which is can be accessed on all our social media pages. And the request form is just a Google form. It's pretty short to fill out. Our goals in creating that was really to make it trauma informed, and that was a lot of what I worked on initially with Laura, my counselor colleague, just trying to make that process of requesting financial assistance a trauma informed process. So we really try to make it so that as much as people are comfortable disclosing about their situation, they can disclose, and they don't have to rehash their trauma history if they don't want to.
Right.
Yeah, and then we also, have been navigating that balance between, knowing that documentation can be a barrier for accessing aid, especially through traditional power structures. But we also do need to confirm some things, that a person is real and that they live in Austin. So we've tried to strike that balance, just giving people a lot of different options for what that documentation can look like. So those are some of the ways that we've tried to make that request process accessible and equitable.
Cool. I'm glad y'all took that into consideration.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think are some misconceptions people have about mutual aid?
This is a question that I don't know. I think a lot about, especially as it kind of gains traction as a concept, and I think like anything else, it has the potential to be co-opted by capitalism. And I think what I see sometimes is and I really want to try not to gatekeep, because I do think mutual aid can look a lot of different ways. But I think traditional giving and traditional corporate philanthropy, it's not mutual aid. It's not, calling it that is inaccurate. So I think people do sometimes struggle to remove that traditional philanthropy framework from mutual aid and distinguish between the two. And I think looking at power structure is a good way of thinking about that. And of course, it gets muddy like anything else when you try to apply theory to reality. But there is a difference, and I think it's an important thing to distinguish between those two things. And the concept of solidarity, I think, is helpful in distinguishing the difference. I also think people think that mutual aid is only financial, which is not the case at all. I actually think most of the time it's not a financial action. But I think an example is the ATX Mental Health Fund. We have our request form and fund distribution, and that is the main function. But we also have a program called the Mental Health Matchup, which just connects community members to be mental health supports for each other. That's just another form to fill out on our link tree. And we're really trying to get some more people to join the matchup right now. So I wanted to shout that out. But I think that's a great example of what non-financial mutual aid can look like, just building relationships, offering mutual support, even if that's just, a check-in text message and a listening ear, which is what a lot of people need right now,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you, or how do you incorporate your thoughts about mental health accessibility and mutual aid into your practice with clients?
Yeah, so I've talked a lot about this. I think there's a lot of the logistics stuff is just, I want to be an accessible provider. Offering a sliding scale and having multiple avenues for people to access that sliding scale rate is important to me. Trying to be transparent about clients with the financial aspects of this process, and trying to encourage transparency on their part. So, because I really just don't want it to be a stressor for people, but also it is my living. And I think that's a tough line to walk. And I think I'm still, I'm always thinking about different ways to live my values in that way. Another thing that I think I've learned over the course of my career so far is that the advocacy work and the mutual aid work that I do is what makes my clinical work sustainable for me. There's only so many times that you could hear people facing the same crisis over and over and over, and crises that exist because of structural oppression. There's only so many times that you can hear that from my clients, from the people that I care about, and the people in my own life before you start to lose it a little bit and the work becomes unsustainable. And I think for me, what makes that sustainable is feeling like I am doing something about it structurally to change things as much as I can. And I think that for me, that means being involved in things bigger than just me as one provider, because I can't change the world by myself,
Right.
other people to do that. And I think looking to my community and being involved in that advocacy and mutual aid is what gives me that hope, and that that energy allows me to channel that frustration to something that feels positive and feels good instead of despair.
Yeah, creating hope, kind of like you had said earlier.
Yeah, hope is a discipline, and
Mhm.
and I think that is the discipline for me, is doing this work as a way of making the clinical work sustainable.
Okay. Okay. Well, switching gears to you as a therapist for a little bit, what kind of experience do you have working with particularly vulnerable clients, such as those who are transgender, undocumented, or BIPOC, to name a few examples?
Sure. So I started my career at Integral Care, which does tend to work with marginalized communities that are facing different oppressions, multiple different oppressions at once. So a lot of my experience working with those folks was right at the beginning of my career through that job at Integral Care. And I think it's something that I try when I'm thinking about how I'm developing myself as a therapist, that social justice lens and that cultural responsiveness is something that I try to focus on in the training that I do. And I think it's as a white therapist, that's always going to be something that's in the room with my clients who are people of color. And I think it's something that I have to be consciously aware of. And that process of unlearning white supremacy, it has to be an active one. And it's something that I will be doing for the entirety of my career. So I think that's a big part of the work that I do and the training that I do, is increasing my responsiveness to those marginalized populations.
Okay, got it. What could a new client expect from an initial session with you? And also, what about on an ongoing basis?
So my intake sessions, I always say it's kind of like a get to know you session. I will usually try to start by understanding what is bringing my clients to therapy, understanding the different issues that brought them to, seek help in this way, and acknowledging, the challenge of that, of finding help once you start to seek it, and also, the courage it takes to try to fix it, to see what's going on, and really try to face it and fix it. And so we'll kind of go through understanding the history of each individual issue that has, brought a client to counseling. I always ask about trauma, because that's a big part of what I do, is trauma processing, and holding space for that, and being trauma informed in my approach, even if I'm not doing trauma processing, still having a trauma informed practice. And on an ongoing basis, I try to be very collaborative in my treatment planning. So I think a big part of the first session is understanding what a client's goals are for therapy, and then talking with them bringing my expertise to the table, talking with them about the different modalities we might use together, what therapy is going to look like for them, and getting their feedback on that. And then just trying to do the work. I think I try to balance that, being present with people while they heal and while they experience things in their life that happen in the present, while also trying to stay on track for those goals. And if that means diving a bit further into the past, making room for that as well.
Okay. How would you say your clients would describe or experience you?
The adjective I hear the most is probably bubbly. I think that I tend to come off that way. And I think that people that, are looking for the Rogerian concept of unconditional positive regard is very important to me. That is essential to my practice. So I think I always try to be, positive and recognize my client's strengths. And I think that, to me, that's essential to being effective as a therapist. I think I try to be pretty direct. Some clients might need a more directive approach than others, especially some of my adolescents and adults who it's their first time in therapy, when they're like, what is this? And it's like,
right,
hey, well, we're going to learn that together, what therapy looks like for you. So sometimes, sessions can look like me, having in mind a specific, concept or activity. I try to do a lot of psychoeducation. I'm not really into the man behind the curtain approach to therapy. I want my clients to, if I am doing an intervention, I want my clients to understand what that intervention is, and as much theory behind it as they're interested in, and just have that transparency and that collaboration. And I think the other thing I get a lot is I try to be as Socratic as possible. So I don't want to have to say the insight, even if I think I know what it is. I would like to ask the right questions to get someone there themselves, because people always, I feel like learning is always more effective, and insight is always more effective when people can get there on their own, instead of just someone in the armchair telling you what you're feeling or why you're feeling it. So I try to use a lot of Socratic techniques just to ask good questions, and that help people get to that insight on their own.
Yeah, I love that approach. Are you a therapist who will laugh or cry with your clients?
Yeah, I would say probably laugh more than cry. And I think for me, sharing tears with clients, I think is it's something that obviously happens because we're all human, but I think a lot of times I will try to be transparent with my emotions, but also for clients, especially that are particularly people pleasing or have certain trauma responses to witnessing someone else's emotional response. I think I try to just be conscious of each individual client's needs around that, and try to be conscious of my own emotional responses and what I'm showing on my face, because I don't want my clients to ever feel like they have to hold space for me. But humor is a big part of how we cope with life and how I cope with life. And I think it's absolutely necessary to be able to share that with my clients, and just show up as a person with them.
Totally. You mentioned the phrase holding space a few times. And one of the questions that I ask people, and that I'll ask you now, is, how do you define holding space for someone?
Yeah, it's one of those phrases that we use as kind of a shorthand for something that I think therapists, we all kind of feel it, but it is really hard to describe. I think for me, it means just being present with people, trying to provide validation for their emotional experience that they're having, and witnessing that. I think a big thing that I learned early on in that first job at integral care was just I saw the value in witnessing, because sometimes that was all I could do, was witness what someone was going through. So I think witnessing is and just being seen is a big part of holding space, and just trying to understand and empathize with my clients without necessarily putting the burden on them to have to explain themselves. I think, and that's where that skill of empathy comes into play. And I think that's something that that is, I'm always learning and practicing as a therapist. So yeah, that combination of like being present and validation and empathy, that's all under the umbrella of holding space, I think.
Got it. Okay. What is the best advice you've ever received from a supervisor?
So my supervisor, Natasha, is amazing. The best advice I would have received from her early, well, I guess maybe not early on, further along than honestly it should have been. I was really trying to figure out self-care for me as a clinician. And I remember having a conversation with Natasha in supervision where I was explaining how it was hard for me to come home and just like, of all the things I wanted to do, just like make myself dinner or like do these like basic things at the end of the day that make me feel better, but also take effort. And I think for me, it was like, I felt weird putting effort and making it like a priority to like do these basic things, like take care of myself, like the mundane things, It just feels, especially when you're dealing with crisis every day, it feels so unimportant. And I think she really talked about just like giving myself permission to put that effort into taking care of myself and approach it like I would approach other areas of my life that, require that effort and energy. And I think that was just so helpful to think about that idea of like giving myself permission to like prioritize those mundane tasks. And that like, that was a worthwhile use of my time. I think I really needed to hear that at that point in my
Absolutely,
career.
yeah.
And I think I go back to that advice a lot with my own clients when I see them, when we're talking about self-care and how to prioritize those mundane but essential things that keep you going,
Yeah.
Yeah. And then yeah, I guess that's the answer. I was gonna shout out my boss Elise right now, who just gave me some great advice this past week. Actually, we're doing an IFS training and practice session, and she talked about trying to remove agenda as much as possible in a session and go with the client system to understand what they're needing. And I think that's something that I do that I have had to learn, and as a therapist, is how to remove my own agenda and make that process collaborative. And I don't know, I've heard it a lot, but somehow like hearing it from her this past week, like it really clicked. And in the context of IFS, like applying that to this modality, like it just really clicked for me. But she's an incredible therapist, and I so appreciate my coworkers and the support and insight I get from them whenever we're together.
Well, it's always good to have coworkers that you know, or just other therapists around you that you know and trust,
Yeah. I feel really, really lucky to be at this practice that just aligns with my values so much, and other clinicians that are like-minded and also brilliant, and then I can learn so much from.
Cool. What have you personally learned about yourself and or the world through your practice?
So much. I feel like I learned things from all of my clients. I think I get a lot of windows into different experiences. And I think one of the reasons that I came into therapy, I think, was because my parents are what some therapists would call cycle breakers, and what they always refer to as cycle breakers. How do you end the cycle of generational trauma? And I think a lot of what I love about this work and what I talk about with my clients is just that question of how do you end that cycle and be that cycle breaker. And I think I came into it, understanding my parents' experience to the extent that I could, growing up, but also I think, one of the great projects of my career has been understanding that, the answer to that question of how do you break that cycle. And I think within that, there's a lot about, how do you process trauma in a way to, truly be in the present, and how do you integrate the different parts of yourselves, or at least, have compassion for the different parts of yourselves, so that you can feel whole and show up for people as your whole self. And yeah, I don't know. I think there are a lot of different answers to that, and I learn a different one with every client.
Nice.
Yeah.
I think it's so important,
Mm-hmm. It really is. And I really do see it as a two-way street. Like I think I learn so much, like genuinely, from every person that I interact with, both other therapists and my clients. And I think, I hope that they learn as much from me as I from them. But
yeah,
I find a lot of value in that, and just, the privilege of having this job where I get to think so deeply about things all the time. Like I love thinking about things, and I love, being with people who show up and think about how to improve themselves, every day. Like that is such a privilege. And through that, like I learn a lot about how to about myself, and how to work on myself. And yeah, it goes both ways, definitely.
Yeah. So I know you were just talking about self-care a few minutes ago. What do you do to take care of yourself?
I think the mutual aid work is a big part of that, making the work sustainable, mentally and emotionally. Having very firm boundaries with my time is a big deal to me. I keeping firm to that schedule I've set myself about when my working hours are. Sleep is so important. And this is something that I really haven't even, since when I was working in other settings, I had less control over my schedule. I got a lot less sleep, and I was a lot less happy and fulfilled as a person, I think. And one of the great things about the practice I'm at now is I can't set my own schedule. So, I'll work 2 evenings a week, and then I get to sleep in a little bit some days. And I try not to have any sessions before 10 a.m. And that is the ultimate self-care. It's just that extra hour of sleep is incredible for my health and well-being. And just spending time with friends too. Spending time with friends and family is what sustains me and gives me that energy to show up for my clients, and also just to do that. And also I've done my own therapy. I'm currently in the process of finding a new therapist, although therapists work, you have different therapists for different things. But I have a therapist that I worked with that really got me through grad school and that first year and a half after of my career. And I'm really grateful to her for that help, and just for holding space for me when I really needed it. And that is a big part of my self-care as well.
Well, you answered that question already.
Have I done therapy myself? Yeah. Yeah, I have.
How would you define happiness?
I think for me, happiness really is, I think a lot of it comes from the people in my life. My relationships are really important to me, especially my family and my friendships. And I think that's a big part of what brings me happiness. I think engaging with art that makes me feel a certain way, is really important, specifically music and live music. I think that in some ways I am at my happiest when I am at a show and just sharing that experience with other people. And reading also is like a big thing it's like a self-care thing, and it also just it brings me so much joy. And writing and sharing that with other people is another thing that makes me happy. So I think it's like, yeah, that combination of fulfillment in my work and the people in my life, and my creative outlets and my experience of other people's creativity, like all that combined just makes for feeling happiness. But also happiness, it's a mood, and it's, transient in a lot of ways, and it's never going to be there all the time. And I think part of happiness is just, learning how to be present with it when it's here, and living with the idea that it will not always be here. And I'll let you know when I figure that out.
Thank you. We can have a podcast specifically on that.
I'll be like, no, I found the answer.
Well, Samantha, is there anything else you think would be good for a potential client or other therapists to know about you and or mental health accessibility and mutual aid?
I don't know if there's anything else about me. I think these questions were awesome, and I think I covered a lot of it. For mutual aid, I would just really encourage people, like, if you have an idea or if you have, an issue or a disparity that you see in your community, like, it is easier than you might think, and harder in some ways. But I really just encourage people to, to innovate and get creative and build relationships with other people that can hold you accountable while you try to build something new. And that's been a really, joyful experience for me. And I think that, I don't know, I just want to say, like, there's nothing very special about me or even, ATX Mental Health Fund or any of of course, I think the people on the board are special because I love them. But really, like, we don't necessarily have like any like unique quality that makes us able to do this. Like, I really think anyone can do this with the right accountability and with trying to make that effort in good faith. And I think it's what we need, as people to, we need 1 million HX mental health funds all over the globe. To keep building agree. New things. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Samantha. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This was a really awesome conversation. And I love any opportunity to talk about this stuff.
The next question. The next question. The next question. The next question.
Thank you for listening to NextQuest podcast. I learned something new today, and I hope you did too. Stay tuned for next week's episode featuring Lisa Wheeler, licensed professional counselor, who will be discussing her practice in an area of specialty, clients with non-ordinary experiences. NextQuest podcast is sponsored by Jan Dimmitt Resources. Save yourself the time and stress of credentialing and let the experts at Jan Dimmitt Resources do what they do best. For over 20 years, Jan Dimmitt Resources has provided administrative support and credentialing services to mental health professionals in Texas and beyond. Visit their website at jandimmitt.com. That is JANDIMMITT.com, or call 512-731-5725 for more information on all the ways they can make running your practice easier for you. NextQuest podcasts rely solely on donations to keep this project going. Please consider becoming a patron on my Patreon page at www.patreon, that's patreon.com/NextQuestPodcast, or you can make a one-time donation on my website at www.nextquestcounseling.com/aboutnextquestpodcast. You can also support the podcast by liking our Facebook page. Until next question, this is Noah Garcia signing off.